All right. So what is a riparian? In these sessions, we've talked about watersheds, we've talked about wetlands, and how important all those things are to water quality. So this is the last piece of the puzzle that we have to put together in order to really understand how water corridors operate and how important they are to our ecosystem. They're a lot more important than we realize, even though they only make up a very small amount of the land in the United States, or even in the world, actually. So if you look it up, riparian is defined as a transition zone between fully terrestrial and fully aquatic systems. So what does that mean? Well, it's this area right here and right here in between the forest or the land and a waterway. Okay, it's not the waterway and it's not the forest in the upland. It's only this area that we're going to be talking about today. Okay. Things that you need to know about it is a lot of the riparians are known for their high water tables, which is really important when it comes to flooding and how it helps control or prevent floods during the spring, during the summer, any time of the year. All right. Okay. So we talked about what a riparian zone is, which is this land right here, or what we call the water's edge. And it can be on the edge of a wetland. It could be on the edge of a pond, a river. We even have riparians on the edge of oceans. Okay. So what is the difference between a riparian and the actual wetland? There's several differences that you need to know. One, an upland tends to be a lot drier. They become wet during runoff or during a rainstorm, but then that water usually flows down into the riparian zone, and then that feeds into the wetland. Okay, so it's the upper land. Now, notice that in this picture and in the last picture that I showed you, there's slope. I will be showing you some pictures that we have less slope. And so the upland is a little less defined than it is when we have full-blown forest. Okay, so a wetland, once again, is this waterway. Now, remember from our lecture about what a wetland is, that can be a marsh, it could be a slough, it could be a creek, a stream. All of those are considered wetlands. So the best way to remember this is the riparian is going to be the area that goes from the water, which is your wetland or your stream, to the forested area or your upland. I just want to remind everybody also that we have somebody in the, okay. I want to remind everybody that a wetland is defined as areas that stay wet, okay? And the vegetation that grows in a wetland adapts itself to the wet climate. With a riparian, the vegetation that grows there doesn't necessarily adapt itself to a wet climate. So that's going to be important when we talk about that in a little bit later. But it also need to note that both of them do serve as functions as water filters, removing sediments and pollutants from water. All right, get to the next slide here. All right, I found this table when I was doing some research to put this PowerPoint together, and I thought it did a really good job because there's a lot of differences between a stream and a river that has a flow, whether it's a slow flow or a fast flow, than we do in a lake or a wetland that may be no flow or a very slow flow. And both of them play a really important role when it comes to riparian areas. Okay, so when we look at a riparian, another thing we need to understand is what impacts the stream flow and what impact does that have on water tables. In riparians, we tend to have 3 different types of stream flows. Okay, we have the ephemeral, the intermittent, and the perennial. Okay, your ephemeral is going to be one that has a lower water table. And if you look at the picture right here, you'll see this line right here, the blue line, that represents the water table that is often found in an ephemeral stream flow. Now, these usually happen during runoff in the winter as we get the snow melt. Sometimes you might not even see the water because it's already saturated into the soil, trying to make its way down into the, hold one moment, please. Thank you. All right. The other stream flow that you might see is the intermittent. Now, this usually does have water running. It might be a really narrow flow or a narrow stream. It's usually shallow, and it may not be here all year round. But if you'll notice, it does have a much higher water table. So the water is, with this water table, pushes up this water into the channel of the river. And this plays a big role on keeping water in that channel throughout the year. Now, this may only be like 6 months out of the year, but it usually is wet, even if you can't see water. And then the last one is our perennial, and then that one is the one that lasts year round. These are your bigger bodies of water. And notice that the water table is even to the height of the water in the channel. So that makes a big difference. And this is important when we start looking at riparians and trying to understand if they're considered healthy and how long are they there each season of the year, and how does that play a role in our riparians. Okay, the next slide. All right. So this is until I really started studying water. I played on a lot of rivers and I enjoyed them as a child. Matter of fact, I was even a whitewater raft guide, but I didn't understand or have even a clue that there's parts of a river that are really important to the type of habitat it helps support, such as, did you know that there's parts of a river called a glide, a run, or a pool, or a riffle? So what is a glide? Well, let's start actually with the riffle. You guys have seen riffles. These are the shallow areas that are going over rocky areas that cause what we call waves or rapids. Those are considered riffles. Now, these are important to spawning fish. It's also important to insects, which feed the birds and so on. Okay, a pool is a deeper area of water, could be fast flowing, but it's usually slower flowing than a riffle. Now, if the water table goes up and the water is higher, then the pools become a glide because they don't tend to slow down. They might actually be a little faster, and it's a little longer area of water. And then the ripples will turn into runs because the water is so much higher above the rocks that you don't see those rapids, as we call them, or you don't see the bubbling water that you see forming over the riffles. So this is important. You've got to have, in any river system, you've got to have these present in order for it to have a diverse habitat and used by different fishes, birds, insects, mammals, and so forth. Amphibians, it makes a big difference on what amphibians are in that area as well. All right, the last definition I need to give you is an alluvial valley. Now, this is really important to us here in North Dakota. We have a really unique habitat area and landscape that a lot of other states don't have, such as did you know that a sandbar is actually a riparian as well? Now, we don't see sandbars in the southern states that have mountains and whatnot. And prairies are also considered sandbar, or prairies are also considered have riparians as well. But when a river has a wide uh, or broad valley, and the shorelines could actually be anywhere from 100 feet to a quarter mile apart, that's still considered a riparian. And this is really important because alluvials play a really big role in well-developed floodplains. Right now, as the sun is coming out and our temperatures are rising, and all this white stuff is turning into from a solid into a liquid water, these valleys play a big role in helping us prevent uh, a lot of floods in several communities throughout our state. All right, so let's talk a little bit about North Dakota's riparian uh, zones. And if you'll wait, I have some notes on that. I want to make sure that I tell you guys. Okay, so in the first picture right here, this is considered the Missouri area. And every one of these creeks and tributaries that feed into Lake Sakakawea and whatnot play a role. They all have riparian zones, but their riparian zones are going to be just a little bit different than the riparian zones over here in the Red River Valley. Over in the western part of the state, we tend to have more of a deciduous type of forest there, which plays a big role. I'm sorry, I have that backwards. In the eastern part of the state, we have a deciduous forest, and in the western part of the state, we have more of a coniferous forest. Now, when I talk about forest, I'm talking about the forests that are in the upland, not in the riparian. And so, what would you think the trees would be closer to the water's edge? If we're primarily a coniferous forest in the western part, I would assume that we would see more evergreens. But actually, riparian zones have their own unique habitats and they produce different trees. One of the trees that you see often in the western part of the state is willows. And of course, we all know about the cottonwoods. What you probably didn't know, that the cottonwoods depend on these riparian zones to flood every year, because if they don't flood, then they're not able to reproduce. And then the willows are really cool because did you know that you can actually take a length of a willow tree and just drive it into the bank of a river and it will propagate and become a tree without us even having to do anything other than putting it in the soil. So the willows are really important to riparian areas, and you will often find a willow along the riverbeds throughout the United States. Now over here in the western part of the state, in the Red River area, you're going to see more of like ash and the oaks are over there in that area. But you're also, once again, going to start seeing the willows. Willows really do really well in our riparian zone. What I thought was an interesting fact when I was looking at this, oh, and then we got one more river system that we need to talk about now, which is the Souris River. And if you didn't know this, we actually call this the Mouse River in North Dakota, and the Souris is the French name for mouse. And the Souris River actually starts in Canada, flows south, makes a loop, and then flows north. So many people think that the Red River is the only river that flows north. That's not true. Part of the Souris River also flows north and joins the Red River up in Canada. Now, this river tends to be more of prairie and grasslands that it's flowing through. And it's really important because the Souris River tends to flood quite a bit because of the channeling system. And so it really depends on those prairies and flat areas for flooding or for floodplains. Okay, so these pictures, by the way, came out of North Dakota Habitat books. And if you hadn't had a chance to go online, just type in North Dakota Habitat books. There's one on wetlands and there's one on riparians, and it gives you a lot more information about how cool these rivers are and how important they are to our ecosystem here in North Dakota. All right. So I mentioned earlier what makes North Dakota riparians so unique is a riparian could be 5 feet wide, and that's it. And then, or it can be over a quarter mile wide. And it usually happens in our grasslands or our bigger rivers. Matter of fact, because we have such a unique riparian zones and habitats here in North Dakota, it's the reason that we are able to support over 100 different fish species here in North Dakota, where many states have far less than that. So next time that you're on, this is the Missouri River, and the next time you're on the Missouri River, look at, and you're on the sandbar, I want you to look around because these are very unique habitats for a lot of birds and a lot of insects. We think that this is the place that we're just to pull our pontoon boat up and have a nice cookout and a family gathering. But every one of these sandbars create a very unique habitat that's very important to the overall North Dakota habitat. Just a different perspective when you go out in the water. All right. So what do these riparians do for us, and why do we even care? Well, the next slides are going to explain that to us. The first thing is traps and stores sediment. If it didn't trap and store sediment, that sediment could possibly get into our wetlands or our rivers, and it would choke out a lot of the wildlife and the habitat that we are expecting for plants and fish and amphibians, insects. It could kill that. So the riparians play an important role. And that's why when we talk about riparians, we often talk about the type of trees that are in there, because that root system of the trees and the grasses that are located in the riparian, the different riparians, is what actually holds back a lot of that silt that would end up in our waterways. They're really good on helping keep moisture in the soil, which is important for growth. The other part is they often carry contaminants, or they trap the contaminants before they get to our waterways, which is really important to our water quality. Remember, every one of these waterways supplies water to a household somewhere. And then trapping a lot of the excess sediment that we talked about in order to keep it from harming the aquatic animals that we're so proud to see. Not only does it do that, but it also filters. One of the things we don't realize is as the snow is melting, and that water's got to go somewhere. And we talked about watersheds, how everybody lives in a watershed and it's a storage area in which rivers and streams flow. If it wasn't for riparians, every bit of salt, animal waste, litter would end up in our water systems. And so riparians do a really good job on trapping all those pollutants before they get to our water system. They're also really good on producing nutrients and other pathogens that we do need in the water to help have a healthy and a higher quality of water. So that's really important for us. All right. Another thing that riparians do for us is they store water, and which is really important. And we already talked about how the different types of riparian channels, whether it's intermittent or it's perennial, plays a big role in how much water we have in our water table. And remember, it's those water storages that keeps that water from flooding our areas, such as our farmland or our communities or our homes. So it really does play a role in preventing flood damage. The other thing is, as this water or the snow is melting right now and the water is running off, there's some energy in that water. And if this water was to run at a high rate, we would see a lot more flooding. But because the riparians slow that water down, they absorb some of that energy from the water, we have less flooding than we normally would see. So they play a really important role right now as we're going through our melt. Also, riparians play a really important role that I think I need to point out to you as making sure that it slows the way our river channels or our water channels are filling in, but it also plays a role in reducing that energy of the runoff and that runoff, keeping that runoff from eroding our banks within our water systems. All right. We talked about this already, but I'll mention it again. Riparians are super, super important. They create and maintain habitats for fish and wildlife. They connect habitats. If it wasn't for, we have certain wildlife and animals that live in the uplands. We have certain wildlife and animals that live within the riparian. And then we have certain wildlife and animals or aquatic animals that live within the body of water. If we didn't have the riparian, we wouldn't have a way of traveling, and it wouldn't be the corridor between the upland animals and the aquatic animals. All right. And they make great shelters, by the way. That's important too. Okay. The last two things that we need to acknowledge that riparians do for us is not only does it hold water, but it helps release water at a slower rate. So that way we have more moisture through more months of the year than we would have otherwise. Because remember, if this runoff that's feeding all of our stock ponds, our wetlands, our sloughs, our rivers and creeks, they move. Those waters move. And if we didn't have a slow infiltration of water coming out of the groundwater, not only coming up, but also going back down into the ground, a lot of these waterways would be dry for most of the year. And that's a big problem when we talk about irrigation, or if you want to fish, or even recreation. That all plays a role in how healthy our riparians are. All right. Okay. So what are some of the other ecological functions of a riparian? We talked about this. These are little cards that I found that if you guys wanted to print them off and or if you just type in ecological function cards and print them off, and this is from a site called Cows and Fish. It's a great way to study about different riparians and what roles they play in our ecosystem. And then they talk about what services. So one, because of riparians, and we're able to slow the flow of water that leaves our ecosystems, it keeps drinking water affordable. Okay. Also, by playing a role in cleaning and providing a higher quality of water, when we bring it from the water source and into your home, that also keeps water affordable. Remember, we talked about back in wetlands, because we have more structures now than ever before, we have more development. If it wasn't for the riparians helping us with flood resiliency and drought resiliency, we would have more catastrophes throughout the state of North Dakota. As well as we use it for recreational areas. We've talked about this every time we talk about aquatics, how important water is to wildlife viewing and various cultural recreation that we all enjoy. It does provide shelter for livestock and food and water for their well-being. It helps keeps our groundwater recharged, which is important, especially if you live off of a well water. The last thing you want to see is it going dry. And then, of course, it helps prevent erosion and sediment control. All right. So we have many threats that our riparians are facing. This is just a statement that I found on North Dakota Fish and Game uh, site. And I thought it says it just gives information that I guess I didn't realize that happens here in North Dakota and how important the riparians are to North Dakota's well-being, overall well-being. And it talks about not only non-point source pollution, but siltation and sediments, habitat loss, talks about how it really helps on dissolved oxygen levels, which are really important to have in healthy aquatic habitats. So I put that on that slide so you guys can look into it. If you just simply go to the North Dakota Game and Fish, the whole article that this came from is located there. And I strongly encourage you. So what are some things that can happen or threaten our riparians? Well, one of the things that can happen is actually recreation. We just talked about that a few minutes about the sandbars and how, I live on the Missouri River and I know how popular they are in the summer as places to gather. And we're not necessarily doing the best thing for that riparian area or that aquatic habitat by having so many boats. But if we're smart about it um, and we're just wise in how we use that resource, we would be less of a threat and maybe even be somewhat of a benefit. Another thing we're seeing a lot of is more development along the riverbeds. Everybody wants a view of the river out their back window. I mean, I could sit there for hours watching that river, but that's not necessarily the best thing. In order for me to have a view of the river, that means I need to cut down that riparian area because I don't want a tree in the way, or I don't want tall grasses in the way when I'm trying to get my kayak down there. So, development is really playing a role in how healthy our riparians are. Down cutting. People like to have their shoreline, so they tend to cut down the trees that are really important to the riparian habitat. So we have to watch that. And then when we start cutting down trees, we start seeing more erosion along our banks. Matter of fact, I'm noticing that we're getting more and more steep banks along a lot of our riparians here on the Missouri. So that's something that we got to be conscious of as we're moving trees. And if we move trees, then we're also going to be losing other vegetative loss that is really important to the birds or the smaller critters within the forest. So that's important. And then once we take out the trees and we start changing the quality of our waterways, that's when the invasive species that we don't want start making their home in our rivers, our ponds, our lakes. We start, not only am I talking about like zebra mussels and the carp, but different grasses and different plants that aren't native to North Dakota and are not native to our wildlife habitat, whether we're talking birds or ducks or fish. They're here because of the natural habitat that we already have existing here in North Dakota. So that's one of the threats that we have. A lot of people, well, I wouldn't say a lot of people, but if you talk to some people, especially in the summertime, one of the things that I hear is, why don't we just straighten out the channels? Why don't we move some of these sandbars and make them a little deeper and a little bit wider so we can get more boats? Well, remember, the natural flow of water within a riverbed or a lake bed is there for a reason. And when we start trying to alter it, then we're altering the habitat within the riparian area, which ultimately is going to alter the habitat of the upland areas. And it's also going to alter the habitat within the aquatic water itself, along with the water quality. So we think we're doing a good thing when we go and dredge rivers, but not necessarily. Matter of fact, we have some protected species that are in our waterways, such as the piping plover. and they love to nest on our sandbars. So if we go and we start dredging out these sandbars, we're going to be losing some wildlife that we only unique to here to North Dakota or along the Missouri River. And we have a nice community of catfish along the Red River. And if we were to change the siltation or the sediment of the Red River, we could lose that habitat as well, or that population. So these are just some things to think about when we're thinking about riparians. We will have one more day of however you want to, Zoom meetings or Teams meeting, where we will get to talk, put all this together. I know this has been a lot of information over several days or several weeks, but we hope that you're getting something out of it. And Andrea, if anybody has any questions, that's the end of my presentation.